go. And we're recording. And good evening and welcome to the Derby Public Library. My name is Nicole Signoli and I am the director here, as well as I'm in charge of adult programming. And we have a repeat customer, a repeat performer coming. We've worked with Massaro's Farm before. And in case you don't know, if you live in our neighborhood, there is a little community garden in our backyard. And that is for all of you and my neighbors here on Elizabeth Street and here in Derby. Massaro's Farms, I want to give you a plug, is always looking for volunteers to help tend the garden, manage the garden, and then also the neighbors are eligible to reap the harvest. So, and trust me, we sit there looking at all the food going, no, it's for the neighbors, we can't eat it. So we hope you do participate in that. Tonight, we are going to be talking about virtual veggies, no real veggies, virtually, with Massaro's Farm. And today, we're going to have a program led by Corey Thomas, who is the education director at the farm. Corey, please take it over.
All righty. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, we have, Massaro Farm is managing 13 different grow your own gardens in the valley. We have gardens in Ansonia, Derby, Shelton, Oxford, and Seymour, and they are for the community, they're for the neighborhoods. So we rely on volunteers to help visit the garden sites and maintain them, as well as hopefully take some veggies home with them. So if you're interested in getting involved with that aspect of what we do, I have my email at the end of this presentation today. And in case you haven't heard of Massaro Community Farm, we are a certified organic veggie farm right on the Ansonia-Woodbridge border. We're on 57 acres, currently farming on about 10 of those acres. And we operate a vegetable CSA share program where folks can purchase their veggies from the farm. And we also donate 10% of what we grow to local food pantries. We also run children's and adult educational programming. So we do adult workshops similar to this one. We do some on-farm workshops, some virtual, and we have kids programs as well. So we have a explorers program for kids to go hiking our trails. And we're also gearing up for a full day summer camp program. So lots of things happening. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved, feel free to send me an email or check out our website, massarofarm.org, or any of our social media, Instagram, Facebook, things like that. All right, well, I am going to share my screen here so you can hopefully see my presentation. So Veggie Gardening 101, some of you might be new gardeners, some of you might be experienced gardeners. Hopefully both new and experienced gardeners will learn something new from this presentation. We're going to cover a couple of different things. We're going to cover topics like raised bed gardens, what to plant, when to plant it, and how to plant it. We're going to get into composting, which is a really beneficial aspect of gardening that also helps the environment. We're also going to talk about soil health and pest management. So healthy soil means healthy plants, and plants without those pesky pests usually mean you're going to get more veggies for yourself. So we're going to cover lots of different topics today. So what to plant? If you're an experienced gardener, or maybe you are a home chef, you might have really specific things in mind as to what you want to plant. So you might already have your planting list put together and ready to go. I have a couple different categories here. I have things I like to call like easy pickers, like plants that are usually pretty easy to grow, and the instant gratification plants, as I like to call them, because they're things you can pick and eat right off the plant. There's not really a ton of prep involved. And those include things like lunchbox peppers, which are really tiny sweet peppers. They only get about 2 or 3 inches long. Ground cherries, which are something pretty uncommon. You won't find them in a grocery store. You'd probably have to go to a farmer's market or something like that. They're similar to tomatillos, which you may find in a grocery store, except they're smaller. They're about the size of a dime at the biggest. And to me, they taste like a mixture between tomatoes and pineapples, which sounds kind of strange, but they taste delicious. Very, very prolific once the plant gets started. You'll put them in the ground and you'll kind of like wonder like, okay, are you gonna do anything? And then all of a sudden, like a month in, they just explode and produce all these amazing sweet little berries. Cucumbers, tomatillos, again, kind of like ground cherries, but used more for salsas and things like that. Tomatoes, carrots, and strawberries. These are kind of things that are really easy to plant. Sort of those instant gratification plants. I have strawberries with a little asterisk there, just because strawberries are a perennial plant. So if you get you usually don't plant strawberry seeds. You usually get a seedling from a hardware store or a local farm. If you leave those plants in at the end of the year, they will come back the following year. They're perennial plants. Really, really great for people that don't want to do any weeding because they spread and they completely cover the ground. So it's great for those that don't want to do any weeding. And generally, you want to replace a strawberry plant like every 3 years because they kind of start to decrease in production after that. And then there are some of those next level things you might want to include in some recipes if you want to make some, different meals. So lettuce mixes, radishes, eggplants, beans, broccoli, squash, spinach, onions, and kale. These are all like pretty straightforward plants to grow in your garden. Not too much difficulty, pretty common to grow. One of the trickier ones there, I say, might be broccoli, just because, based on your experience in the grocery store, you might be expecting this big head of broccoli, where in reality, it might be kind of small when you're starting out, but that's okay. And then I have this third category for the bold, and they're kind of bold for different reasons. Corn is a bit of a tricky one because corn is actually wind pollinated. In order for the plant to produce new ears of corn, wind has to come through and blow the pollen from one plant to another plant. And so what that means is in your garden, if you have only one row of corn and the wind comes in sideways, all the pollen is just going to blow out of the row of corn and not hit any other corn plants. That's why if you normally see corn, it's grown in a field, right? That way, no matter which way the wind blows, corn pollen is hitting other corn plants. So corn's a little tricky just because you usually have to grow a lot of it in order to grow it successfully, but it certainly can still be done. Watermelon, and also in that category kind of fits pumpkins. They take a lot of space to grow, some of those winter squash varieties or melon varieties. They take up a lot of space, a lot of ground cover. And specifically melons, especially in Connecticut weather, are pretty tricky to grow. So I encourage you, if you want to try to grow watermelon, go for it. Just don't be disappointed if your first year growing, they're like, this big baseball-sized watermelon, but that's all right. Cauliflower and celery, those are both kind of on my tricky list as well. And again, maybe you've had great success with these. I find them to be a little trickier. Cauliflower, again, kind of like the broccoli, stays really small, and the heads sometimes get damaged by the sun. And celery, also a little difficult to grow, especially there's some different processes. I believe it's called blanching, where you kind of cover up the celery plant. So anyways, if you're a new gardener, I definitely recommend sticking to some of those things on the left side of this page, just kind of easy starter plants for you. So there are some details you want to pay attention to on a seed packet. So let's say you're getting seeds directly from a hardware store or a garden supply store. There are some really great details you want to pay attention to on the back of that seed packet. And it's going to vary depending on where you get your seeds from, right? There are some seed packets where they have detailed little tables and instructions on whether you're direct sowing or transplanting it. It's really, really great information. And I swear there are some seed packets that are like on the third full moon of the, and like they tell you to plant something. So some of them are very, very vague. Thankfully, most are very specific. So here are the details you want to pay attention to on that seed packet. You want to pay attention to the expiration date, especially if you're getting secondhand seeds. Maybe you have a gardener friend that has some extra seeds. Pay attention to the expiration date. Just because the seeds are from last year or 2 years ago doesn't mean they aren't good anymore. There's actually this really handy link from Johnny's that you can check out that actually tells you, depending on what type of seed you have, how long that seed is good for, if it's not packed for 2020 or 2021. A little germination test might be helpful to tell if your seeds are still viable. And all that involves is getting a damp paper towel, placing some seeds in that damp paper towel, and then covering it with another damp paper towel and putting it in a sunny windowsill, and checking to see how many seeds germinate or start to sprout, right? Granted, you don't want to do that with your whole seed packet because then you've used up all your seeds to test if they're good or not. You only want to use a couple of them. Some other details to pay attention to on that seed packet: how long it takes to harvest the plants, how long it takes for them to germinate, time to transplant. So let's say you start the seeds inside, how long does it take, and at what temperature can you put them outside, right? And that's all going to have to do with the average last frost date. We're going to talk more about that later in the presentation. And then also some things about actually planting the seeds, right? So how deep to put the seed, whether you can put that seed directly in the ground or if you have to transplant it. So here I say carrots versus kale. Carrots, you usually want to direct seed those plants. You want to put the seeds directly into the ground. Whereas kale, you can start that in a container or a seed tray inside somewhere and then transplant those seeds out once we've kind of reached some warmer weather. When to plant it. Okay, we already kind of jumped into this, right? When to plant the things we want to grow. And that we had to ask ourselves some questions. So are you direct seeding? Are you transplanting? So are you starting the seeds inside and then bringing them outside? What's the frost tolerance? And then what is the growth period, right? How long does it take for this plant to grow? For example, I don't want to plant Brussels sprouts in August because even though it's warm enough for those plants to grow, Brussels sprouts take something like 100 or 120 days to grow, and they'll die off by the time that first frost comes around. Whereas if something has a high frost tolerance, for example, garlic we plant in the fall, right? And we harvest that in the early summer. So that's something that has a very high frost tolerance. Same thing with snap peas. So there's the common saying that we plant snap peas on St. Patrick's Day, actually. So we've already planted some snap peas, which you actually see in that bottom right corner there. We've already planted snap peas in our gardens, even though we may still have some nights below freezing. In fact, we're expecting some in the next couple days here. Whereas something like a tomato seedling or a cucumber seedling, that cannot handle frost, and that's something we're not going to put in the ground yet. So here's this really handy calendar, and it's kind of vague, right? Like this would be more specific based on our zone. But this will give you an idea of what's a cold weather tolerant plant versus a warm weather plant. And essentially the difference here, look for the things that are right in the middle of our growing calendar and only have one growth cycle. So beans, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, corn, cucumbers, onions, peppers, squash, tomatoes also works out in here, eggplant. Those are all things they're going to have one cycle of growing in the year, and they need warm weather. So they're not going to go outside until, at least in our temperature, in our zone at least. Our average last frost date is May 20th. So most of these warm weather plants, they're not going to go out until a week or two after that average last frost date because they like that warm weather. Whereas there's other things like beets and cauliflower and lettuce and spinach that can handle that cold weather much better. And as a result of that, you can do 2 cycles of planting, right? So for example, peas, I've already planted snap peas. We're in March, so you can see I've already planted snap peas, and I will harvest those and then maybe give the bed a break and plant more peas later on in the growing season, right? Because they can tolerate that early fall crisp weather. So this is a really handy calendar, and it gets more specific depending on what varieties you're looking at or different kinds of plants. But this kind of gives you an idea of what can tolerate the warm weather versus what can tolerate the cool weather. Spinach is my best example. I've harvested spinach by moving the snow out of the way and picking spinach leaves. So spinach is a really, really, really great cold weather crop. It's like almost perennial in Connecticut. It'll just stick around, which is great. How to plant it. How are we going to plant our seeds? So if we are transplanting, meaning we've started a seed inside, either in a seed tray or even like a little recyclable container you have, you're going to want to start them out in a seed tray or a container. You want to use that calendar and your average last frost date, which again, that's May 20th around here, and determine when to plant those seeds, right? You want to make sure you have either a grow light or a sunny window. If you do have in a sunny window, which makes sure it's not too drafty, there's not too much cold air coming in and hitting those new seeds. Make sure the soil is moist. This is by far the most important aspect of starting out new seeds. That's going to be your biggest downfall, is making sure you are watering sufficiently. And it doesn't mean you're drowning the seedlings, right, the new seeds, but you're making sure they stay moist. Because if those seeds start out and they just put out those first leaves, they don't have that reservoir, that root system yet that can search for new water, right? They don't have, there's not a lot of buffer on either side. So you need to make sure you water new seeds. And when you're planting the seeds, make an appropriate sized hole or furrow in the ground. A good rule of thumb is you want to plant the seed twice as deep as it is large. So for example, if you're planting peas, I want to make a hole the size of 2 peas. Other seeds obviously need a much smaller hole. And again, check your seed packet. It will have instructions on how deep to put those seeds that you're looking to do. Add compost if needed. So if you have any compost, you can add that to the seed tray as well. If you're purchasing seedlings, perhaps from a hardware store or a garden supply store, and you skipped out on planting seeds, you're like, I'm going right for the seedlings, and that is a-okay. Remove the containers that they come in, even if they're the recyclable cardboard compostable ones, because if you remove that container, that's one less boundary for the roots to get through. So it's a good idea to remove those paper pots that some of the seedlings come in. Check the roots and make sure you separate them out if they're totally root bound. When you get, like, for example, a really big tomato seedling from a garden supply store, right? And you open it up, take it out of its container, it's got a bunch of roots wrapped around that root ball. Make sure to spread those out. It'll help your plant take off faster. You're going to cover the seed or the root ball and then water it. If you're starting seeds inside, heat mats are an option as well. In that top left corner there, I've got a picture of a seed mat, heat mat. They're not usually too expensive if you want to be really fancy and use one to kind of get your seeds a jump start. And again, I can't reiterate enough, just water, water, water. Don't drown your seeds or your seedlings, but make sure they have consistent moisture while they're growing. A really quick note about purchasing seedlings. Since the last time I've done this presentation for the library, which I think was 2 or 3 years ago now, they've gotten better at this, our hardware stores, our Lowe's and our Home Depots. But what I used to notice, and maybe I just haven't noticed it yet, is that they will sell seedlings that are not ready to go outside yet. So for example, sometimes you might go to a Lowe's or Home Depot this time of year, late March, early April, and you'll see tomato seedlings or pepper seedlings and think, great, awesome, let me grab these and bring them home and plant them in my garden. And they will die because it's just too cold. So be mindful, just because something is available to purchase as a seedling to put out in your garden does not mean it's ready to go outside yet. Again, I think they've gotten a little better about it this year from what I've seen so far at my local Lowe's, but be wary of that. So let's jump into a very quick crash course on composting, because composting is going to be very beneficial for your gardening, also to help manage your own food waste. It's great for combating climate change. Composting is great for everything. So I kind of want to jump into that real quick because it can be really helpful to your gardening endeavors. So what is composting? Composting, it's the process of decayed organic matter used as plant fertilizer, AKA recycling vegetables, right? We are recycling plant matter and using it to help our garden. What's really nice about that is the nutrients and the organic matter in that compost will release slowly to the rest of your garden plants, opposed to the quick release of a synthetic fertilizer or a liquid fertilizer. It's just going to go right to the roots of your plant. So it's easier on the plants you're trying to grow. You can be more liberal with the application of it and not worry about burning your plants with synthetic fertilizer. So composting is great for your garden. And what it is, it's a combination of carbon and nitrogen. And when I say that, there's different ingredients that are heavy in carbon and different ingredients that are heavy in nitrogen. And it's going to get broken down by bacteria, worms, and different microorganisms. So we're taking different vegetable matter, dead leaves, things like that. It's getting broken down by microorganisms, and then we're able to create more garden soil and apply it to your garden. How does it work? So top left here, or top right, I should say, you can see an example of the different layers that we have here. So let's say this is your compost pile and you've made a little bin out in the backyard. You might put some twigs or dry leaves down at the bottom, and then you're adding a nitrogen source and then a carbon source and then a nitrogen source and a carbon source, and you're piling them one on top of the other and making what I essentially like to call a really gross lasagna. So what are the different carbon and nitrogen sources? I have a nice little chart there. Some carbon sources are dried leaves, dead pine needles, maybe pine bedding from a chicken coop. I have dead pine needles there twice. Small dead branches, maybe you've raked some things up from your yard. And some nitrogen sources. The most popular one by far is actually going to be your vegetable-based kitchen scraps. That's probably what you're going to be using, right? Green lawn clippings or weeds, or if you've got a neighbor with a horse farm or a chicken coop, how do I put this? Herbivore-based manure can be very helpful. Don't try and add, when you clean up after your dog, don't try and add that to your compost pile. It will not be helpful. But if you got a neighbor with chickens or maybe horses, that is amazing for your compost pile as an awesome, awesome, awesome source of nitrogen. So you're making these layers, right, in a compost pile. And then you're turning it, which basically means you're mixing it up. And the reason we mix it up is that, okay, we have all these ingredients in this pile, right? And then things are going to move in to start to break that down. So you're going to start to see worms and little roly-poly bugs, and there's bacteria that's just going to naturally be present, and it's going to start to break that down and create soil again. But what happens is eventually the microorganisms can't reach everything, right? Because those things need air to survive. And way down the middle of your pile, it's anaerobic. There's no air. So when you turn your pile, it's called turning, but you're just mixing up the ingredients you have in your compost pile. And that adds more oxygen and more air to your compost pile so that those organisms can access the rest of the ingredients to create compost, create garden soil. And what's really, really cool about this process, if you're feeling very sciencey, is that you can actually measure how successful the bacteria and the worms are based on the temperature of your compost pile. And they actually sell these really neat little compost thermometers. You can get one on Amazon, and it looks like a meat thermometer, except it's about 2 feet long. And you stick it right in the middle of your compost pile to see how hot it gets. And a compost pile, when it's working or cooking, it's usually getting between 120 and 140 degrees in the middle of that compost pile from the bacterial breakdown. And that means it's working. That means you're doing great. And if it's cold, that means maybe maybe there's too much carbon, not enough nitrogen. Maybe you haven't mixed it recently. There's a couple different ways to troubleshoot that. Something important to add, some people might have said, listen, I've tried a compost pile before. It smelled horrible. It attracted, pests, things like that. And to that, I normally say you probably just perhaps had too much nitrogen. A compost pile that is too nitrogen heavy, so too much veggie scraps, too much weeds, too much wet material, it won't smell good. But if you're composting at the right ratios, adding enough carbon sources, it just smells like soil. It shouldn't smell bad. So for example, on the farm, we have a pile where we add kitchen scraps or old weeds or veggies that didn't get sold or something went bad. We have a pile of that, and then we have a pile of dry leaves. And Farmer Steve will mix those together to generate compost for the farm. You can also purchase compost from a store. That's great fertilizer as well. Saves you the trouble of making compost. The only thing is you want to make sure you add any compost well before adding any plants. Otherwise, what will happen is the compost can burn the plants where it's too much nitrogen all at once. It can actually cause your plant some problems. So if you do add that finished compost, right, you've mixed it, it's heated up, it's cooled down, you've mixed it, it's heated up, it's cooled down. Eventually, it won't heat up again. And that means you've cooked your compost, it's done, it's ready to add to your garden. Give it some time once you put it on the garden bed. You just don't want to burn your plants. So how to compost? There are a lot of different ways to do it. My favorite on the far right, because it is the cheapest, some people use pallet bins to compost. And no, it doesn't look very fancy, but I'm in favor of cheap and functional. So you can use pallet bins to have some different compost piles going. If you're feeling stylish, right in the middle there, that's actually a model from Ace Hardware that I've assembled before. That's a really neat turnable compost mixer. There are definitely some pros and cons with those smaller compost rollers. One of the pros is that it's very, very easy to turn the compost, right? You just crank the handle and it spins it around, which is awesome. Something I have found with those smaller models is that they don't necessarily generate the heat that you want to see in a compost pile. And that heat is really great because it also generally kills any pathogens. For example, if you had, moldy tomato leaves in there, it'll kill that, or it'll also kill any weed seeds that have carried over in your compost. So sometimes I'm usually in favor of a larger compost pile, but the turnable compost bins are really helpful because they're easy to mix, usually pretty pest proof. Nothing's going to get in there, right, to start to eat the kitchen scraps or anything. So they're very user friendly. I will give them that. And then over on the far left here is vermiculture. So actually having a compost bin that's designed so worms can break down the material. And I'm not saying anyone has to do this, but I have heard that some people keep vermiculture bins like this right underneath their kitchen sink. So talk about not smelling bad, right? This is something that some people just do right in their kitchen. Because if you do it right, it doesn't smell. And talk about really accessible, right? Finish dinner, scrape your plate right into the vermiculture bin. And it's important to note there are certain things you don't want to add to a compost pile, right? So you want to try and keep it vegetable based or plant based. You don't want to add any meat products, fish, things like that, things that are heavy in oil. So let's quick talk about soil health. So we talked about compost, so hopefully we're adding compost to our vegetable garden, and that's helping improve the health of our soil, but healthy soil means healthy plants. So why would we test the soil? Maybe you want to know what the texture is like, what the pH of the soil is, right? So the acidity or alkalinity, and then what different nutrients are in that soil, right? Nitrates, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. What is available for your plants to use in your garden. So it's important to note that soil is an ecosystem, right? It's not just dirt. Inside soil, there are microorganisms like worms, talk about different types of bacteria. There's also fungi that are in your soil that are interacting with the plants and helping different plants. So all sorts of different relationships in the soil that rely on the right mix of nutrients and pH, things like that. So some people, some gardeners will actually test their soil to see what might be challenging, right? If you're having a really hard time growing things in your garden, maybe it's your soil. So there is soil testing that is available, both from UConn and both from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. I believe the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station offers free soil testing, last I checked. UConn, there's a small fee involved, but their test is usually a little more fancy and kind of fine tune what you're looking for from UConn. Oh, great question. How often do you turn compost? So this is where something like a compost thermometer comes in real handy, right? Because if you put together your compost pile and you just let it sit there and you're right, okay, I don't need to mix it yet. And you check it with your compost thermometer and you'll watch that temperature go up over the course of a day or two, or maybe even 3. And then once it starts to cool back off, that tells you it's time to mix. And if you don't have a compost thermometer, that's okay. Take a shovel, dig into your compost pile a little bit. If you still see steam coming out of the compost pile, that's a good sign, you're doing great. But if it's cold to the touch and nothing's really happening, that might tell you it's time to mix again. So you're gonna wanna mix it once it cools off. And eventually, if you reach the point where it's just not heating up, no matter how much you mix it, that tells you it's done or ready to be applied to your garden. Awesome question. So 2 different sources for that soil testing. And there's some quick little charts here to kind of show you all the different variability that can be in soil, right? So over here on the right, you see how pH impacts nutrients in your soil. So if you have really acidic soil or really alkaline soil, it can really limit how well plants can take up different nutrients in your soil. And some plants don't mind really acidic soil, right? Things like blueberry plants, for example, they love that acidic soil. But most of your garden plants are going to want something kind of right in the middle. And then over on the left here, you can see that soil is made up of different particle sizes. So your soil might be really heavy in sand, right? So that means water is going to flow right on through. Or it might be really heavy in clay, and that means it's really difficult for the roots to kind of get through. And so ideally, you want a mix of sand, silt, and clay, or of just the different particle sizes to help your soil be healthy and be beneficial for your plants. Pest management, our favorite, right? Everyone loves bugs in their garden. So there are some really common garden pests that you might have. Some of the more common ones are aphids, squash bugs, Japanese beetles, tomato hornworms. Those are my favorite. Leaf miners, potato beetles, mice, chipmunks, getting to some bigger things like deer and groundhogs, right? So depending on your garden setup, these could be common pests that you have in your garden. Granted, all of these kind of come with their own different pros and cons to managing them. Massaro Farm, we're an organic farm, so we're always going to promote that organic solution just so that we can make sure we're not damaging our local ecosystem. So generally, some solutions to all the pest problems, right? Again, each of these different pests is going to have its own fine-tuned solution, but some general things you can do. One of the biggest things you can do to help mitigate pests in your garden is crop rotation. And no, I don't mean going out there and like twisting your tomato plants in place. No, that's not rotating your crops. What I mean is that you are rotating what you're planting in your garden year by year. So for example, at Massaro Farm, we have a learning garden. So it's a couple raised beds, 8, right? No, we're up to 12 raised bed gardens. And I have a little puzzle every year of basically making sure whatever I plant, I make sure I don't plant the same thing there that I did last year. And the reason behind that is that it helps interrupt the pest cycle, the life cycle of that pest. Something that comes to mind is we had an issue of, I believe they are, I'm trying to remember the name, white flies, cabbage flies. The name is escaping me, but I used to work on this farm that had a bunch of brassica plants, Brussels sprouts and broccoli, that was being completely attacked by these tiny little white flies. So bad that you could tap one of the plants and it looked like snow. Not ideal for your nice picturesque garden. So what we did the next year is we did not plant any brassica plants in that row, right, or anywhere near it. And the reason we did that is that when those flies lay eggs in the soil or on the plant material, when those larvae or the eggs hatch the following year, their ideal food source isn't there anymore. So we're kind of interrupting that life cycle. So make sure you rotate what you're planting year by year. And then you get into some other things you can do, like hand selection. So if you have a small garden, maybe going around just hand picking some insects off, you can actually put them in just a bucket with some dish soap. That will kill the insects. You don't have to worry about squishing anything if that's not your thing. Things like insecticidal soap applied to your garden can be helpful, and it's very gentle on the plants. So Dr. Bronner's there is a really great example of just a organic solution. You can spray that on your plants. One of the downsides is that if it rains, that then completely falls off the plant. So you might need to reapply every once in a while. But that's a really gentle and organic solution to some of the more common insect pests that you might have. For some of the bigger pest problems you might have, cayenne pepper spice is great. So for example, I used to work at a garden that had a huge issue with chipmunks. There were chipmunks everywhere getting in the garden, and also groundhogs. Yes, I planted a whole bed of kale, went inside to eat lunch, came back out, and the bed of kale was gone, thanks to a lovely, friendly neighborhood groundhog. Cayenne pepper is a great solution to that. So thankfully, you can buy it in bulk at some certain grocery stores that actually sell it in bulk. So you're not buying like 10 of the little tiny containers, right? And kind of pour some down any chipmunk holes or rodent holes you see. It'll keep the rodents away from that area. And obviously, it doesn't like impact your plants. Unfortunately, you're not going to get spicy tomatoes if you put cayenne pepper on your tomato bed. So it keeps some of those larger pests away, which can be really helpful. If you're feeling very, very fancy, you can get into things like promoting beneficial insects or predators to your area, right? A really great example of that is the tomato hornworm. Some of you may have found them on your tomato plants. They're a little, quite large caterpillar, about this big. They're green. They're very well camouflaged with a tomato plant. But what's awesome about tomato hornworms is they have a natural predator in our area, a parasitoid wasp. So it's a wasp that actually lay eggs on the caterpillar. So if you ever see a caterpillar, I apologize, Sam was eating dinner. If you ever see a caterpillar that has little white spikes on it, that means the wasp has done its job. Leave it alone. Leave that tomato hornworm alone. The eggs are going to hatch, and it's going to keep the caterpillar population down. So there's all these really cool, very intricate relationships in your garden, battles that are being played out day by day. So if you can find the way to help out the good team, so to speak, by studying your specific pest, you can really help mitigate some of those problems from pests. Keep an eye on the time here because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So there's some things to do for seasonal bed prep or seasonal garden prep. And some of you may have just a flat, a garden bed or different rows of flat space to use. Some of you may have raised bed gardens or tabletop garden beds. So some of these things might be a little different depending on what type of garden you have. But there are some things to do seasonally, right? So for example, spring, this time of year, we might be raking out the beds, getting rid of any winter debris or leaves that have accumulated. You may be adding fresh compost to the beds. Vermont Compost Company, that's a really big, well-known compost company in the area. So I put their little picture there. You could plant a cover crop. I have with kids here. Sorry, I've used this presentation with multiple groups, so I still have with kids here. But hey, if you have kids or grandkids, they want to plant a cover crop, that's great. And what is a cover crop? A cover crop is a term that means any type of plant that's going to benefit your garden soil. And their cover crops have a couple different purposes. They might help prevent soil erosion. They may help add nitrogen to your soil. They may help break up the soil to add more aeration to your garden soil. Some of the cover crops are a little tricky. You have to be good about making sure they don't come back once you're trying to actually plant vegetables, because at that point they're a weed, right? They're no longer helpful. But if you're feeling like a top-notch gardener and want to get really fancy with some of those organic soil care things, you can get into planting cover crops. In the fall, you can just use cover crops in the fall. But in the fall, once you're done growing plants for the season, you're going to want to cover that garden bed with some form of mulch. So dead, dry leaves can be really helpful. You can use straw. Do not use hay. Just to clarify, straw is usually larger. It's larger in size, usually chopped up pretty finely. Whereas hay is something you'd see at like an animal feed store. There's usually little seed heads on it. And that's the reason you don't use hay, is that if you put down hay trying to mulch your garden, congratulations, you have planted a hay field for next year. And we don't want that, right? So mulch is great. It's going to help preserve your garden soil over the harsh winter, especially if you live in a really windy area. And it's going to help preserve that soil for the next growing season. So mulch is great in the fall. It's also great in the middle of the growing season, right? Once you have, for example, established plants growing in a garden bed, you could mulch around those plants, right? It's going to help cut down on how many weeds are sprouting up, help keep the soil moist between watering. So mulch isn't just for at the end of the growing season. It can also be very helpful in the middle of the growing season. You just want to make sure you give your plants some time to get some height before you put mulch around them. All right, how'd I do? I left about 15 minutes for questions, which is excellent. Normally I talk and only leave like a minute or two. I'm going to leave these slides up in case I have to jump around to answer any questions. But I'm going to check out the chat here, and please feel free to ask any questions. If it's easier, if you'd like to unmute to ask your questions so you don't have to type, that's okay too. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have. Sure, Deborah.
Hi, just unmuted. I have a question. I started compost last year for the first time.
Yay.
And I'm so excited. Yes. So it's been doing about a year, and I did kind of primitive, with 2 old garbage pails, and my husband drilled holes in them. It's kind of hard you can't really roll them. So it's not the best, but for the first time, so my question is, but I'm loving it. It just seems like those bins are very, very expensive for what they
can
are.
be, for sure.
Yeah.
They definitely can be.
So my question is, I'm going to start a garden in an area so I figured I'd start an 8x4, a raised bed. Can I use, so it'll be on the grass. Can I use the compost as the first layer?
Yeah, you certainly can, for sure. And also, a little side note, if you ever want to see, get some ideas on how to put together raised bed gardens, feel free to come check out the Learning Garden at Massaro Farm. There's a design that I've used at a couple different farms now, and none of them have fallen apart so far. So I think they're pretty sturdy. But to answer your question, absolutely, you can definitely use compost as that first layer. Technically, if you were to have a raised bed that's just compost, you can actually run into some nutrient availability problems, believe it or not. Like usually the mindset is, yes, just keep adding compost. And that's true. Sometimes I believe it's phosphorus that eventually you can have a problem with if there's too much compost and not enough just soil content. But yes, absolutely. If you have good compost, add it to your garden bed. Use it as that foundational layer. That'll be great for the plants.
And then what would you do? Put topsoil on the top, like buy some?
Right. Yeah.
Topsoil?
I would try and get some topsoil. Be careful what company you get it from. Maybe check to see what other local gardeners are using. sometimes I have great luck with garden soil and I find stuff that's awesome and wonderful. And other companies, I'll order it and I just find that the next year, like it's mixed in, so you don't sear it away, but there's little like gravel pieces and things, like a lot of rock content. So ask around based on where you are and what other gardeners have had success with. But yes, I'd say maybe get a soil delivery. And at that point, what might be helpful is to actually put the compost as your top layer then, like do a top soil layer underneath and maybe the compost on top.
Okay.
Because those nutrients will kind of filter down through the topsoil as it's rains and things like that as you water your garden.
Do you mix it or just like actually put a layer?
You could put a layer. You could also mix it for sure, especially because you've already put the soil down and your soil hasn't like stratified. Like there's not really a lot of soil structure yet, so it doesn't hurt to mix in the compost at that point. No, I think that's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and then of course, and just be mindful if you're putting it down on grass. Depending on how high your raised bedded, that's probably fine. If you want, you might want to put some weed block fabric down underneath just to kind of cover up that grass. If you have some really, really ambitious grass that might try and poke through the raised bed there. But yeah, but that sounds great. Good luck with your new garden project.
Oh,
Exciting.
thank you very much.
Of course. And don't worry about the primitive compost bins. The worms can't notice. It's okay. All right, let me see. I got a question in the chat here. Let's see. I expect to have fresh compost ready by spring planting time. Awesome. Is it better to use it as top dress versus, we kind of just talked about this, right? Versus putting it straight into the planting holes to avoid burning seedlings. Oh, okay. As long as it is aged, meaning it's no longer heating up, it's not hot. I think you could do either or, in my opinion. I think if it were me, I'd probably just do it as a top dress. I'd probably put it over the whole garden bed because, right, we're working on soil health, not just where the plants are growing. And so, yes, you could, if you want to like really ration out the compost, you could put a little bit in each seedling hole. But if you put it as a top dress, you're now covering the entire garden space, which then allows more nutrients for the roots once they start to spread out. So if you have a little bit, I'd say maybe go right into the holes. But if you have enough, I'd say put it right over the whole garden bed. Try and make sure you're treating the whole soil. If it were me, I'm sure that, ask 10 farmers how to solve a problem, you'll get 11 answers, but that's what I would do. Any other questions? While I'm waiting for a question, I do just want to add in, if you're interested in, keeping up with Massaro Farm, what we're doing, we do have some pretty consistent adult workshops. We have another one coming up in the 3rd week in April on backyard goats. So if you had any dreams of having backyard goats, we're having a workshop on that. And hopefully by that point, we will also have at least 2 baby goats as part of the workshop. We have a very, very pregnant mama goat right now at the farm, so we're excited for that. We also do a series of beekeeping workshops on the farm with the Connecticut Beekeepers Association. So if you kind of want to get involved with beekeeping, we have some awesome virtual workshops with Connecticut Beekeepers Association. And yes, the community gardens, we need lots of hands to help care for the gardens, and also it's there for you for that produce. So maybe if you don't have the space for your own garden, but you want to get involved in some gardening, definitely let us know. We're still looking for lots of help with those garden sites for sure. Ooh, one more question in the chat here. Any tips for growing vegetables in pots instead of in the ground to avoid pests? Best fertilizing plan. So yeah, so obviously when you're growing something in a pot, you kind of have a more limited nutrient profile, right? So that might require heavier feeding. When I say feeding, like adding more nutrients. So maybe being mindful about adding compost year by year to try and help balance out what that plant is absorbing out of the pots. And yeah, it could certainly help cut down on some of the pests. Depends where you have it in your garden or in your yard, right? Because there can always be pests that fly in or move in. So certainly some of those more ground dwelling pests will maybe stay out because they can't, climb up the sides of a pot. But any of those airborne things like different kinds of moths or flies definitely wouldn't have any problem reaching it. But yeah, it certainly could help in avoiding those pests. And might just want to have some compost on hand to kind of help feed the pots there. If you're planning to start an in-ground garden, how should you prepare the soil? So one of the first things you're going to want to do is get rid of that grass. Because if you still have any remaining grass, you're going to have a really fun time weeding all season long. So something that I would do is you can either solarize the grass. So cover it with a big black tarp and let it completely die off that first year. So there's nothing there, and then maybe put up a boundary of some kind, whether you're making a trench around or putting some kind of like wooden barrier, just to kind of help keep that grass, because grass, they create rhizomes, right? They put these little underground roots to keep spreading. So you want to make sure there's some way that that grass isn't going to move back into your new field. So definitely find a way to keep that grass out of that space. And at that point, that depends if you want to get into things like tilling up the soil, which you certainly can do, but you don't have to do. So keep in mind that soil has already created soil structure. There's already an ecosystem there underneath that grass, which kind of gives you a little bit of a boost. But you can, tie in different soil amendments. One thing I'd say to start with is definitely just get your soil tested. Try and send it to one of those locations I listed, just to figure out what you're working with, right? If you need to add some more nutrients, if you're nutrient deficient, maybe you got to go add some more compost to that soil. If you live in a pretty busy area alongside a road, it's really important to make sure there's no like lead levels in that soil. So that can be really important if you're starting a new garden, which is super exciting. Congratulations, you should do that. Yeah, for sure. All the gardens, all the time. Oh, hold on, let me see this chat. Yeah, of course. Any other questions on gardening or composting or farm stuff? Oh yeah, Emily, go for it.
I'll just, instead of trying to type it out, I had read something about like habituating the seedlings to outside, where you would actually like bring them outside for like a couple hours a day and then bring them back in. Like when would you do that? Is it necessary for all of them?
Yes, it's certainly a good idea. Thank you. I'm glad you touched on that. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, right? Like I'm going to take them out for an hour a day and then take them back in, but it's true. So one of the issues, if you have a seedling that's growing just inside, it's not developing the resilience it needs to stand up to different wind conditions. Like it's just going to flop over as soon as you put it outside. So yes, it's called hardening off your seedlings. It can be really beneficial. So if you have a seed tray, you start it in a nice sunny windowsill, you have a bunch of peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers ready to go. Put them outside on your back deck or front porch, whatever, for maybe like an hour. Maybe a day after that, put them outside for like 3 hours, maybe then half a day. Give them some time to acclimate. It'll give them some time to adjust to the weather, adjust to the wind. So yes, absolutely. I'm glad you touched on that. I didn't have that in my presentation, so good catch. Sure. So the farm's learning garden. So someone asked about the farm's like educational things that we do. So we have a learning garden at the farm. It's a couple of raised bed gardens where we kind of have a little microcosm of what's happening on the rest of the farm. So we have different plants going to kind of show folks what we're doing there. And that's where we host a lot of our educational programs. So we do virtual field trips. We have an explorers program where kids go and explore the nature trail, do some planting. Pre-COVID, we had Growing Sprouts, which is like a program for kids ages like 0 to 2 to like explore the garden with their parents. And we're hoping to actually bring that back pretty soon here. And it's also where we'll host our summer camp. So it's kind of just a small area for us to kind of show folks what's happening on a larger scale on the rest of the farm. So yeah, we have our learning garden space, then we have some chickens, a single rabbit that's soon to get some additional friends, and then our goats and a rescue sheep. So we've got a whole little group at the farm, which is exciting. Our visitor policy, we obviously, because of COVID, we kind of closed down in terms of visitors on the farm. So right now, our nature trail is open. So we have a trail that is behind the farm that's open for hiking. There are some kind of small stream crossings, so bring some waterproof shoes. But there is a nature trail that goes behind the farm that's open to visitors right now. The rest of the fields and things like that aren't open to visitors for the time being. But we're always working on, watching the health protocols to see when we can kind of start working on opening up the other parts of the farm again. So for now, just the trail, but we're working on it. And it's a really beautiful trail. We did have some, we just finished up the last one. I'll tell you why, but we did have goat hikes at the farm where we had people come to the farm. We take the goats for hikes on the trail, but we just had to finish up for the season because now that there's actually things growing that the goats can eat. My bucket of grain is no longer as enticing as it once was. And so it's hard to get them to stay with you on the trail, because normally you just don't use a leash and they stay with you because I've got the grain. But now if there's little things and stuff growing on the trail, it's kind of, you know, I don't have any power anymore. So we just had our last goat hike this past Saturday. So maybe we'll bring them back. We'll need to keep them on a leash if we do more of them. So yes, lots of things happening at the farm.
Cool.
But yeah, any other questions from anyone about anything about the gardens, about the farm, anything like that? Nicole, what do you think?
I think it was great.
Oh, good.
Reminded me of gardening again, getting outside. You know,
Oh,
this
yes.
past weekend was wonderful about that, you know, cleaning everything off, raking.
Absolutely.
So it was great, but I really appreciate it.
There are scientific studies on how touching dirt makes you happier. So I'm always in favor.
Good therapy, very
Yes.
good therapy. Well, I want to say thank you to everyone who was able to attend tonight. I really appreciate it. Very grounding. Yes, very much, Deborah. Thank you for coming. Please, and again, if you're in the neighborhood, come see our garden in the backyard, and come volunteer as well. And I appreciate, Corey, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. And if you would send me that information, I can always send it to the attendees tonight, and then we can go from there.
Absolutely. Will do.
And
All
there's his
righty.
information. But thank you everyone for coming, and
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. Have
Thanks
a good
very
evening.
much. You too.
You're very
Bye.
welcome.
Thanks, everyone.